It started on a quiet morning when the sun was just beginning to rise over the calm surface of the lake. The air was cool and still, and my cabin sat nestled among tall pine trees, the reflection of the roof rippling gently in the water. I had built that cabin with my own hands years ago, every log, every nail placed with care. It was my retreat from the noise of the city, a place where I could breathe and hear nothing but the sound of wind and water. Then one day a letter arrived in the mail marked urgent from the local homeowners association. I almost laughed when I saw it. I didn't even live inside their community. My cabin sat on the other side of the hill, surrounded by open land that had belonged to my family for decades. Still, I opened it and read the words printed in bold. They demanded that I remove the cabin immediately for violating the HOA's shoreline construction rule. Failure to comply would result in fines and potential legal action. I shook my head, certain it was a mistake, and decided to call the number listed on the paper. A woman answered, her tone sharp and practiced. "This is Linda with the Lakeview HOA. How may I help you?" "Yes, Linda, this is David Collins. I received a notice saying I need to remove my cabin by the lake. I think there's been some sort of confusion." She paused, then said, "I don't think there's a mistake, sir. All structures near the lake must be approved by the association, and your cabin is clearly within that jurisdiction." That statement made me blink. I know exactly where my land starts and ends, I said calmly. "I've owned this property since before that association even existed." "Well, we'll see about that," she replied in that condescending tone that only people in petty positions of power seem to have. "We have our own maps, sir, and they show your cabin inside the managed zone. You'll be fined daily until you comply." The call ended before I could respond. I stood there for a while, staring at the water, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. The next day I drove down to the county office to get an official land survey. It didn't take long. The clerk pulled up the file on her computer, her eyebrows raising slightly as she clicked through the records. "You're right," she said after a moment. "This area has always been outside the HOA's boundaries. In fact, it's not even zoned under their authority. They shouldn't be bothering you at all." I smiled. I had a feeling. She printed the documents stamped with the county seal. I thanked her and left the office feeling a quiet satisfaction. But when I got back to the cabin, 2 SUVs were parked by the gravel road. 3 people in matching polo shirts stood near the dock, clipboards in hand. One of them was Linda herself. She looked at me like she'd been waiting for a fight. "Mr. Collins, we've sent multiple notices," she said. "This cabin violates HOA Code Section 13.2 regarding unauthorized waterfront structures." I held up the papers I got from the county and said calmly, "This land doesn't belong to your association, Linda. You're standing on private property." Her face froze for a moment before she forced a smile. "That's impossible. Our maps clearly show this area under our jurisdiction." "Then we should compare maps," I said, handing her the document. She took it reluctantly, scanning the seal, her expression shifting with every passing second. One of the men beside her leaned in, whispering something. She looked flustered for the first time. Her voice faltered. "These records might be outdated," she said. "We'll have to confirm with our legal team." "That's fine," I said, "but until you do, I suggest you and your team leave my land." They hesitated, exchanging glances before walking back toward their vehicles. I watched them drive away, the sound of gravel crunching under their tires fading into the distance. For the next few days, I didn't hear a thing from them. The lake remained peaceful, just the way it had always been, but I knew Linda wouldn't let it go, not someone like her. Sure enough, a week later, a new letter arrived, this one marked final notice. They were escalating the issue to the HOA board and threatening to contact county enforcement. I laughed quietly, setting the paper down. I already knew the county's position, and I wasn't about to back down. This was my land, and I was ready to prove it again if I had to. That weekend, I invited my friend Mark, who worked in real estate law. He brought a full record of property lines, satellite images, and survey documents. We sat by the dock, spreading everything out on the wooden table as the sun dipped below the treeline. "You've got them cornered," Mark said, grinning. "This shows their jurisdiction ends nearly half a mile from here. Your land isn't even connected to theirs. This isn't just a misunderstanding. This is overreach." I nodded, staring at the papers, the reflection of the orange sky flickering across them. I knew what I had to do next. I was done letting people like Linda push others around just because they thought they could. The next morning, I drove straight to the HOA office. Their building sat at the entrance of the gated community. Across the road, rows of freshly planted flowers lining the walkway. Everything about it screamed control and perfection. Inside, I found Linda behind the front desk. She looked up from her computer, her polite smile fading the moment she saw me. Mr. Collins, this is private property, she said firmly. Only residents and association members are allowed in this office. I held up the county documents again. These are official. I said your letters and your so-called jurisdiction are invalid. This land is not part of your association, and I expect you to stop contacting me immediately. Her face tightened. She reached for her phone. I don't appreciate being threatened, sir, she said. We're just trying to maintain order in our community. Order doesn't give you the right to trespass on private property, I said evenly. You and your board came onto my land without permission, and that is a legal violation. Her hand froze above the phone before slowly lowering. She didn't expect that I could tell. The air around us felt heavy, thick with her uncertainty. Then a door opened behind her, and a man in a suit stepped out, gray-haired with sharp eyes. He looked like someone used to being in charge. I'm Howard, the HOA president, he said calmly. I understand there's been some confusion about property lines. I nodded. No confusion on my end, Howard. Your association has no authority over my land. The county map proves it, and your team's presence there was illegal. He took the papers from me, scanning them carefully, then looked at Linda. You told me his cabin was inside our managed zone, he said, his tone cold and precise. Linda stammered. I thought it was. We used the map from the original developer plans. It must be outdated. Howard handed the papers back to me. Mr. Collins, it appears you're correct, he said quietly. This will be handled immediately. You won't receive any more notices from us. That's not enough, I said. Your team trespassed, threatened fines, and harassed me for weeks. I wanted in writing that my property is excluded from your association permanently. He nodded, understanding this time the firmness in my voice. I'll have that drawn up today, he said. As I turned to leave, I caught the look on Linda's face. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked embarrassed, her arrogance stripped away, replaced by something almost like regret. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. The sound of the lake breeze seemed to welcome me back. When I returned to the cabin later that evening, the sunset painted the water gold and orange. Mark called to check in. So how did it go, he asked. They backed off, I said. Finally, it's over. For now, he laughed. People like that never really quit. Make sure you keep those papers safe. I smiled. Don't worry, I said. This place isn't going anywhere. That night I sat on the dock, feet hanging over the water, watching the ripples shimmer under the moonlight. The cabin stood quietly behind me, the woods alive with the soft sounds of crickets and wind. But deep down I knew this wasn't just about the cabin. It was about standing up when someone tried to take what wasn't theirs. It was about showing that calm doesn't mean weak and silence doesn't mean surrender. The lake reflected the stars, and for the first time in a long while I felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that the land my grandfather had once walked was still mine and would remain mine long after the noise of the HOA faded into nothing. A few days passed, and everything seemed calm again. The letters stopped, the HOA trucks no longer appeared near the trail, and for a moment I thought peace had finally returned to my little corner of the lake. Then one morning while I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee, I noticed a black SUV parked near the tree line. It wasn't marked, but I could tell from the tinted windows and clean tires that it wasn't a lost fisherman. A man stepped out dressed too neatly for the woods and started taking pictures of the cabin, the dock, the property line. I watched quietly, then called out, "Can I help you with something?" He looked startled, then forced a polite smile. "Oh, good morning, sir. Just doing a survey for the HOA." I stood up slowly. I already told them. They have no authority here. You're trespassing. Leave now. He hesitated, clearly unsure whether to argue or back down. The silence stretched before he finally muttered something about finishing his work and left his SUV crunching over the gravel. I called Mark immediately, told him what happened. He sighed. I figured they might try something like this. I'll come by this weekend, bring someone from the county. They'll shut it down for good. Saturday morning, Mark arrived with a man named Joe, a county land officer, who carried a rolled-up map and an easy confidence. Together we walked down the trail to the exact boundary line between my land and the HOA property. Joe unrolled the map on the hood of Mark's truck and pointed. Here, this creek bed right here is the legal divider. Everything east of it is yours. Everything west belongs to the association. We followed the line on foot. I could see old metal survey markers half buried in the ground, proof of boundaries set decades ago. Joe took pictures and signed a verification note. He looked at me. You're solid. They can't touch this land. If they try again, call me directly. That afternoon I was back on my porch when I saw Linda walking down the path, her heels wobbling on the uneven ground. She was holding a clipboard and wearing that same forced, polite smile. "Mr. Collins," she started, "I just wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding. It seems there was an oversight in our property database. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, then sighed. We're updating our records to remove your land from our maps entirely. You won't receive any further communication from us. Good, I said calmly. I'd like that in writing, signed by the board. She nodded quickly. Of course you'll have it by Monday. Before she left, she paused for a moment, looking out at the lake. It's beautiful out here, she said quietly. You're lucky to have it. I glanced at her, and for a brief moment, she didn't seem like the power-hungry enforcer from before, just another person who'd forgotten what peace felt like. After she left, I sat there for a long while, watching the water shimmer under the setting sun, the silence of the lake wrapping around me, again the kind of silence that feels earned. But somewhere deep inside, I knew the story wasn't over, because people like Linda and her board never really learned the first time, and something told me the lake wasn't done testing just how far I'd go to protect what was mine. The next week, I was out fixing the small pier that had come loose after a storm when I noticed tire marks again near the back of the property. This time, they led to a small clearing where a few metal stakes had been driven into the ground, bright orange ribbons tied around them. I frowned. Those weren't there before. I followed the trail and found a wooden post with a sign face down in the dirt. It read, Future Development Site Property of Lakeview HOA. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. They were trying again, this time under the radar. I took photos of everything, then called Mark. He didn't even sound surprised when I told him. His voice was calm, steady. They're testing boundaries again, literally. He said, send me the photos, and I'll file a complaint with the county. By the afternoon, Mark was at my cabin with Joe, the land officer. Again, both of them looked serious as they examined the stakes. Joe shook his head. They're encroaching. They know this isn't their land. This is deliberate. He took out his phone and started documenting each stake with GPS coordinates. Mark crossed his arms, watching the lake shimmer through the trees. He muttered under his breath, some people just can't accept being wrong. Later that day, we went to the county office, where Joe filed a formal report of trespass and illegal surveying by the HOA. The clerk stamped the papers and assured us they would be investigating soon. When I got home that evening, I noticed something else, a small drone hovering near the tree line, moving slowly back and forth. I watched it for a moment before it zipped away toward the other side of the lake. They were spying on me now. That night, I installed an extra floodlight near the dock and checked the motion alerts on my cameras. Every few minutes, my peace had turned into quiet vigilance. 2 days later, I woke up to a knocking sound, not at the door, but somewhere outside. I stepped onto the porch and saw Linda again. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 men stood behind her, both dressed in neat blue shirts with the HOA logo printed on them. She tried to smile, but her voice wavered a little. Good morning, Mr. Collins. I assure you this is just a formality. We're conducting a community safety review, and we need access to inspect the dock area. No, you don't, I said flatly. You have no jurisdiction here, and you know that. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, Mark's truck came rumbling up the trail, dust swirling around the tires. He parked beside my cabin and got out carrying a folder. Linda's face paled when she saw him. She took a step back as he handed her a paper. This is a cease and desist order from the county, Mark said, his tone calm but sharp. Any further interference on this property will result in charges. Linda's expression shifted between anger and disbelief. She tried to protest, but Mark cut her off. We also have evidence of unauthorized surveying and drone surveillance. You might want to speak to your lawyer before you say anything else. The silence hung heavy until she turned around and walked away, the 2 men following her without a word. After they were gone, Mark looked at me and sighed. They won't stop easy, but this will buy you peace for now. I nodded, watching the sunlight flicker across the lake. It was calm again for the moment, but deep down I knew the HOA wasn't done, not by a long shot, and next time they'd come at me from a direction I wouldn't see coming. That evening, I sat on the porch watching the lake turn gold. As the sun began to set, the ripples moved slowly across the surface, like time itself taking a breath. For a moment, everything felt still again, but my mind was racing. What would Linda do next? She had that look of someone who hated losing more than anything else, and she had influence, a way of twisting things to make herself the victim. I could almost hear her at the next HOA meeting telling everyone about the rude cabin owner who refused community cooperation. A few nights later, my phone buzzed with a notification from one of the security cameras. I opened it and froze. The drone was back, but this time it wasn't hovering, it was landing near the edge of the dock. I slipped on my boots and quietly stepped outside. The moonlight shimmered off the lake, giving everything a pale silver glow. The soft hum of the drone faded as it powered down, and then I saw a figure crouching beside it, adjusting something. It was one of the same men who had come with Linda earlier. I stayed quiet behind a tree and watched as he placed a small metal object beneath the dock beam before walking away back toward the road. The next morning I called Mark again. He came out within the hour and brought Joe, the county officer, with him. Joe examined the dock, then let out a low whistle. It was a GPS beacon. He said they were trying to mark this as their land through illegal mapping. Mark's jaw clenched. He looked at me with that mix of disbelief and frustration. They're desperate now. We'll handle it, but keep everything recorded. A few days passed, and I started noticing strangers stopping by near the property line pretending to take pictures of the scenery. One woman even brought her dog as a cover, snapping photos of my dock. When she thought I wasn't looking, it was getting out of hand. So I decided to take a trip to the HOA office myself. Mark offered to come along, but I told him I needed to do this one on my own. When I walked into their office, the air smelled like coffee and printer ink. Linda was there behind the front desk, typing furiously. She didn't look up until I said her name. She stiffened and forced a tight smile. Well, Mr. Collins, to what do we owe the pleasure? I kept my tone calm, even as my heart thudded in my chest. I came to let you know that the county has your mapping attempts on record. They've opened an investigation. I figured it was fair to tell you before they show up with questions. Her fingers froze over the keyboard, her face drained of color. What investigation? The one involving unauthorized land surveying and drone activity. I said you might want to check with your field team before denying anything. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain, her confident mask cracking just slightly. Her voice came out quieter. I don't know what you're talking about. Then maybe you should start asking the people working under you, I said, because next time you send anyone near my property, you'll be explaining it to a judge, not me. The room was silent. I turned and left without another word. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the sky a deep blue reflecting off the lake in the distance. I could see my cabin, small and steady, standing exactly where it had always been. But even then I knew this wasn't over, not completely, because people like Linda didn't stop when they were wrong. They stopped only when they were exposed, and something told me that day was coming soon. A week later, I got a call from Mark. His tone carried a hint of satisfaction. He told me the county's investigation had wrapped up, and it was worse for Linda than anyone expected. They had uncovered records showing that she had been using HOA funds to pay for private surveying teams trying to expand the association's territory illegally. She had even falsified documents claiming parts of my land as public access. By the time the county officials arrived at her office, she was already trying to shred papers. Mark said she went pale the moment they showed her the county seal. A few days later, an official letter arrived at my cabin. It confirmed everything. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. In fact, my land was older than the HOA itself. It was listed under protected lakeside preservation grounds. Linda was removed as president, fined for fraud, and banned from holding any position in a community association again. Her name was printed in the local newspaper under a headline that made the entire town talk. I walked down to the lake that evening and watched the reflection of my cabin ripple across the calm water. The sun was dipping low, turning the sky orange and pink, and for the first time in weeks there was peace. A soft breeze carried the sound of leaves rustling and the distant hum of crickets. I smiled to myself, knowing that justice had settled quietly and completely. The next weekend, Mark stopped by with 2 cups of coffee. He grinned and said, "You know, you could turn this into a movie." I laughed and told him no thanks, I'd rather keep my lake drama free. As we sat on the porch looking out over the water, he clinked his cup against mine. Here's to land well kept and neighbors who finally learned their boundaries. I looked at the lake glimmering in the fading light and nodded. Yeah, here's to that.